So everyone in the club knows about the fox hunts we do. We often do it in a recreational activity. And we know a lot of you guys know that yesterday we did this as an impromptu in the field exercise. Well, tonight our first presenter is someone who has worked in public safety radio systems for quite a while, both professionally, and he's also a seasoned amateur operator as well. Please welcome James, November 6th, Oscar Zulu Hotel, to the floor for a great presentation on radio direction finding in a commercial capacity.
Okay, well, we're going to tell an old war story. It goes clear back to the 1990s. And I figured, well, I'd equip myself as I was in the 1990s. This is my old cell phone, brick phone, and my pager. Monsters, huh? Not digital, nope, just a tone. And it wasn't very good range on it, but pagers and cell phones in that day and time were incredibly different than they are now. This is actually one of the first cell phones that they put out there, and I bought one pretty early on. In fact, I bought two, one for myself and my wife. And believe it or not, we still have the exact same phone numbers we were issued way back in the 1990s. I think within days I got it cloned. They gave me another one, but I've had that ever since the early days of these cell phones. So the technology was quite different way back when. And I know how many of you guys are involved in the fox hunts here? I know you can raise your hands. So 1, 2, 3, oh gosh, we got a lot of guys who are interested in that. Now, after I tell you this story, I am not an expert on fox hunts. In fact, I'll admit, I've never done a fox hunt on the ham radio stuff. I had to do it with the commercial equipment that I had working for the California State Police. How many of you are familiar with state police? Ever heard of them? The Capitol, yeah, downtown. Los Angeles, and about 9 field offices. The California Aqueduct. State Police had a big mission. First initiated, actually the story goes that Joaquin Murrieta and Three Finger Jack were running around the state terrorizing mining camps and homes and ranchers all over. In fact, he did it in about 4 places in one day. So he became notorious enough that there were a lot of people who claimed to be Joaquin Murrieta, because that was a cool thing to be robbed by Joaquin Murrieta. And the legislature sent out a team of guys to go out and find this guy and bring him back alive. Well, bring him back. Of course, in those days, you didn't bring him back alive, you just brought him back. And in this case, they brought his head back and Three Finger Jack's hand. Put it in formaldehyde, and it was in these glass tubes, and they were in San Francisco before the earthquake. And then after the earthquake, they disappeared. We assume they were demolished in the earthquake itself. They decommissioned those guys, and years later, when they were building the Capitol downtown in March of 18, come on, let me get it right here. I wasn't around then, so it's not real personal to me. But just to show you how back the state police goes clear back to 1887. March 15th of 1887, the legislature required that the allocation and funding for 2 guys to patrol the state capitol. And over the years, that got upped and upped and up, and clear up into the 40s and 50s when they actually allocated money for a commander, which would have been equal to a chief of police. So old man Beard became the first chief of the California State Police. From there on, they were kind of a haphazard bunch of, we would say, sleepy guards more than anything else. And there were a lot of things that happened in the 60s, like when the Black Panthers took over the Capitol with an armed insurrection and their rifles. And there was no laws against taking weapons into the state capitol, clear into the Senate and chambers. So those guys made it all the way in there, and at that point, they kind of reevaluated the security needs of the Capitol. And they allocated a lot more money for a lot more guys, but they wanted them to be fully trained police officers. My dad was one of those first crew of people to be hired on as a police officer, went to the State Police Academy up at DeWitt here in Auburn. And I was very young then, but he came up, became a police officer, and he probably never did anything in his life that he appreciated so much as that. So the state police grew from there, but prior to that, there were no radio systems for the state police, none. There were no radio systems at all. They were just walking around these state buildings, and they'd use a phone to call in if they needed to. Eventually, the Fish and Game in the '68 decided that they were going to build a fish and game radio system, got some licenses. They didn't have dispatch centers, but they said, hey, state police has these 24-hour offices in the major cities. Let's put a base station radio in there, pay for some of the funding to staff that radio, and we'll give them a fish and game radio, one, to put in a state police car to use as a mobile radio. That was a pretty hodgepodge radio system, but it was probably until the 70s, somewhere in there, the Office of Emergency Services from 68 to 70 stepped in with some radio equipment on OES frequencies and started to help rebuild a radio system for state police. That was not going to work because there were too many competing uses for those OES frequencies. Eventually, in 1973, 74, somewhere in there was a great deal of funding to address the needs of a statewide state police force. We also had a guy named Ronald Reagan who ran for his party's nomination as president. When the Secret Service picked him up, they found that he had an incredible threat level. And so before they brought him back, they said, you guys got to do something about radio because this guy needs protection. And he also needs protection. Prior to that, governors always had a highway patrolman driving them to and from the Capitol home or to an event. That's all, just one highway patrolman. The legislature commissioned a California State Dignitary Protection Unit that may protect the governor and other dignitaries of the state of California, whereas the Secret Service has a shall protect. The president doesn't actually have a lot to say about how they protect him. They must protect him, whereas we may protect the governor of California. So if the governor wasn't real cool going someplace and didn't want his security, he could tell us to pound sand and go home, which most of them didn't, fortunately, but there were times. But the radio system became an issue. We needed a quality radio system from one end of the state to the other. They acquired 3 UHF licenses plus an agreement with OES for the CLEMARS frequency, 460.025, I believe, is the California Law Enforcement Mutual Aid Radio System that OES manages. And it's a mutual aid frequency on UHF that allows large events to take place and for participating agencies to turn their radios to CLEMARS and communicate. So we had that among our other licensed frequencies. And the reason I'm going through this is this statewide system pretty much reflects the system that we're going to talk about at that time, with a couple of additions that we added to our system also. So it's going to kind of go back about 2 months ago. We had a great tutorial on repeaters and CTCSS, or tone-coded squelch systems. And we're going to kind of review a little bit about that because that came in important into how we were able to track this errant radio down. It was in the October of '93, in September and October of '93, when the Sacramento Police Department started having an intense radio jamming situation, mostly in the evenings at night. A carrier would lock up with no voices, no tone, no noise. It would just lock up on a frequency, and more disturbingly, if an event occurred on another district, because they had the Sacramento City North, East, South, and downtown. So they had about 4 channels they were working. Sometimes they'd combine those late at night. But if they had all 4 channels up and running, occasionally this jammer would start on one channel, and then he would migrate to another channel, wiping out the communications, requiring the dispatcher to move all the traffic from that critical incident, whether it was a shooting, knifing, pursuit, all had to move to another frequency momentarily while they gave out their FCC warnings, which pretty much falls on deaf ears. If the guy's keying down on the radio, he can't hear that warning. I hear that all the time. They try to key up right over the top of. Cal Fire does it, County Fire does it. Other agencies, the guy's keyed up, but they're talking right over the top. But he can't hear you when he's transmitting. Anyway, that transmission went on for a very long time, and the Sacramento City Technical Department for the Communications really worked hard to try to figure it out, and they could not. They could not. But the radio system they had was very similar to ours in that we had mountaintop repeaters and repeaters in metropolitan areas on top of tall state buildings. So there'd be a rack of equipment up at a mountaintop in a vault along with other radio systems. You'd have a rack with a bunch of equipment. This is usually more equipment than you would see in a typical state police radio network, as they discussed in that meeting a couple of weeks ago, or a couple months ago. When you have a repeater, you have an input frequency, which most people don't even know what it is. But for state police, it was 465 was the input to the repeater up to the site. So the weak handy-talkies or the strong mobiles would be transmitting on 465, and the repeater would repeat on 460. 460. And this is just a general idea, about 5 megs difference between the two, and the reason for that is you can't have the transmitter dumping on top of the receiver while the receiver's trying to receive, so the repeater can retransmit everything it's hearing from that radio. Down at the bottom you see duplexers. Duplexers are big cans, and what they do is they tend to, you can tune them to where you can create a very high Q network, a very high Q circuit for your radio transmissions to keep the receiver from being overloaded by the transmitter and other equipment in and around the shack. So these duplexers are very expensive, but they're very critical to a modern repeater system. So on the case of the state police, we had repeaters on mountaintops all over the place, and as you drove down the state, you would have to know what frequency to turn to, what frequency pair. We had 3 of them, one in the Bay Area, one throughout the entire state of California, and one in Sacramento for capital operations. The one statewide was used primarily for dignitary protection, where most of the protection took place in the Sacramento area. But as we traveled, we had to become very expert on how to use that system, because you might have 2, 3, 4 repeaters on one frequency in an area. And if you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 repeaters, you might have that because something like LA looks like this. And you get behind these hills and you can't hit that repeater, and you sure as heck can't hit that repeater. So if you're over in this end of LA, same thing in the Bay Area, when you get further down the coastal route, down into the foot of the Big Bay thing, you had to be able to turn to a different repeater, only you didn't change frequency. What you changed was a CTSS, boy, I'm lousy at that, CTSS tone. So these receivers on 465 were looking for a tone. And in the case of state police, our channel tone number 1, we called it channel 1, but our tone number 1 on all of our systems was 127.3. 127.3. So the radio is transmitting a tone you can't hear with the naked ear, and that tone is going up to this repeater, the main repeater, say right here, on tone 1, and activates only that repeater. If you drive around and respond over here, you may be too far from that repeater with your mobile or even with your handheld, particularly with your handheld, and so we assign this one tone 2. Tone 2 would be another tone separated from 127.3. So you could drive all up and down the state and not activate multiple repeaters by changing tones. If you went into the Bay Area, you had to completely change frequencies, but then again, all along the coastal route, you had numbers of tones that you could access various repeaters, which would take your signal back to the dispatch center. Okay, so that's how the Sacramento system, they didn't need a lot of tones. They only needed one tone. They usually had one repeater up on a tower somewhere serving the several different areas of Sacramento, north, east, south, and downtown. So that was not that complicated for them. It just changed the frequency. If you were going to go into a different district or assigned to a different district, you just changed frequency, but the tones all stayed the same. When the state police radio system was built, it originally was built as a mobile radio system. So when guys are out running around in their cars, they could hit those repeaters up on the mountaintops, sometimes at quite a distance, or clear back from the burbs where a state EDD or DMV office would be. They could hit the repeater up on top of the state building. In Sacramento, it was on top of the resources building. In LA, there were several different repeaters, and all of them were scattered around the perimeter of LA. So those mobiles had no problem hitting the repeaters. When I got kicked up to headquarters because I could spell radio, and the guy before me couldn't spell radio, the chief, Dwayne Lowe, who had been the Sacramento County Sheriff's sheriff, he called me into his office after about a week or two, and he said, well, I gave you a week or two to get your feet wet. He was one of those country western type talking boys. He says, so what do you think the problems are with the radio system? And I said, well, Chief, let me tell you. It appears that the handy-talkies are the problem, that the system was never designed for them. And there's this thing called a voted receiver system. And he says, stop right there. I know exactly what you're talking about. And I'm thinking, really? This guy knows what a voted receiver system is? We're going to talk about what that is. He said, that's exactly right. When I got to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department, that was the first thing I heard was the guys out of the car with a handy-talkie could not hit the repeaters. Dispatchers couldn't hear them, and it was an officer safety issue. The union was all over my butt, and the union's all over my butt here now because the guys can't talk on their handy-talkies. You could not talk from the basement of the Capitol and reach to the repeater on top of the resources building because of the concrete and rebar. In places in that basement, it was too thick. Well, that was our major home right there. We needed to communicate from there. So once I described that to him and he understood it fully, he said, you go forth, make that happen. Anybody gets in your way, you let me know who it is and I will kick their butt. That's not what he said, but close enough in polite company. But he said, get it done. Well, dude, I mean, Chief, that's like millions of dollars. That's not a simple thing because a voted receiver system is that. How does this thing keep changing by itself? I don't know. Anyway, that's a signal noise voting receiver system. So if you got a repeater up here, I hope I'm not too low, repeater up here, you got probably a T1 telephone line, big data line that goes back to the dispatch center, or literally you've got a base station in the dispatch center that has the same input frequency and tone to activate the repeater, and it can clearly hear what's coming out of the repeater from all the little mobile units and handhelds all around it. The problem is this area, like LA, got too big as the metropolis built out. It got too far away from this repeater for the handy-talkies to work. So this system is basically a little receiver. It's a box at the dispatch center. It's a box at the dispatch center. And what you do is, it's expensive, but you got to put a receiver near all these locations. You put a receiver at a strategically good place, like on top of a state building, a tower, a radio vault. And all it is a receiver. It's not a transmitter, because you've got a great transmitter here, but you don't have a good receiver up here. So the receivers all have a T1 data line that goes back to the dispatch center. And when the officer talks, little lights come on. This one will handle what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, and then that's 6, 7, 8. Anyway, that's other data there. But there's about 6 receivers that the system will handle. So you got a telephone line coming in each one of those, and it'll listen to all the receivers at the same time, and it will analytically, through electronics, study the quality of the noise background versus the signal strength. And we'll say, this little guy with his little handy-talkie over here talking, this receiver hears him clearly. And that audio will be carried to the voted receiver bank, and the voted receiver bank will take that audio and dump it in front of the dispatcher. So she hears the clearest audio that can be had in this kind of a system. Well, now you got to buy this equipment. You got to get a hold of Pac Bell and buy up T1 data lines, because it's a lot of stuff going through that telephone line. And you're going to do this all over the state of California. And we did. So I drafted up the plans for it, got Telecom Division, State of California Telecom Division to get behind us and do the engineering, and how long it would take to buy the equipment. They had equipment on contract, so that was easy. And then Chief had to go to Department of General Services to say, that has to be done. If we get somebody hurt, you're going to pay a lot more money than what it costs to put these systems in. So we started installing these systems all right around the state. In 1995, or just before 95, the Highway Patrol was going to consolidate. The governor was going to consolidate the state police and the Highway Patrol together. Highway Patrol has a monster competent telecommunications division. There was really no need for me, one-man show, a sergeant with no actual technical training, just a ham radio operator running a state police UHF radio system. So I actually wrote myself out of a job, did all the white papers about what our system is, how it's constructed, the process of the systems we're in, that are going in, where we're at, and then I bailed out back to dignitary protection and traveled around flying on airplanes and getting in cars and having a great time traveling the earth. So I bailed out, State Highway Patrol took over and finished out the rest of this system, and to this day it's working. It changed the officer's ability to communicate. So now what we want to do is talk about the Sacramento City Police Department and why that piece of equipment became fairly critical. So in September to October 1993, the telecom division guy at Sacramento City was at a loss. He didn't know what to do. Chief Arturo Venegas did not know what to do. They were stumped. They did not have the resources nor the technical equipment to go out and track this radio down. They thought, because it happened right after a probation department car got broken into, and 2 radios and 2 chargers were stolen from the car. And those radios had communications capability on all the law enforcement frequencies around, because probation would go out and deal with bad guys that were out of control, and they would call in the PD or the sheriff or whoever to help them, including some of the outlying agencies. So they thought that was what the radio was being used to jam their radio system. They contacted the FCC, and that was about the time the FCC was just getting out of the business of doing anything for radio direction finding. Unless it's something really on a supernova scale, they didn't really get involved. They just said, go hire yourself some techs and go figure it out. Well, we don't really have techs around here. There might have been some people in LA that could do it, or maybe the Bay Area or Philadelphia, but in Sacramento, we didn't have the technology people that could go out and do this and track this thing down. So they went to the Office of Emergency Services. Stan Harder, great guy, was there, ham radio operator. They put the call out. Stan said, there's only one way we're going to do this. We're going to have to saturation bomb the whole Sacramento area and try to find this with ham radio operators who understood RDF, fox hunts, and a few of the folks that had some more sophisticated equipment also. And I'm going to give these guys a recognition here tonight, because I don't think, other than a nice letter from Arturo Venegas, I don't think they got the recognition for what they did. They had Kevin Amy, I don't know, you might recognize some of these names. I think some of these guys are gone. They were really older guys when I was there. Kevin Amy, Les Ballinger, Noel Bartleson, Charlie Britton, a good friend of mine, Gary Bryant, Fred Christian, Stephen Douglas, Jimmy Feltz, Ronald Fiscom, Greg Fox, Jeff Haggard, John Hansen, Stan Harder, me, Paul Kepler, Mike Laurie, David Leon, Rick McCusker, and Rick was he was a sec assistant, he was a techie out at OES that took a major part in this thing. Bob Meyer, Daniel Nunn, Pete Petrata, Joe Ramirez, Bob Ripley, Jack Schwartz, Bert Sousa, Chuck Williams, Ken Wing, and Robert Yoakum, and their call signs are on this piece of paper. It'll be over the table if you want to go see if you can match that up. Anybody recognize any of those names? Yeah, there you go. Yeah, are some of those still alive, or are they gone? Yeah, still around? Yeah, great. Anyway, they put the call out, and they put the call out to the SHARP group, which is the Sheriff's Amateur Radio Patrol, or something like that. And the other one was a state OES and SHARP, State Office Emergency Service, State Police Telecommunications, City Races, the City Races group, Douglas RF. Douglas was he actually was a techie guy that worked on radio equipment stuff, and he had some pretty fine equipment that he could convert with a Yagi to do radio direction finding. The STOP program is the, does anybody remember what that STOP? Sacramento, I don't know if that's, I think that's the city police officers ham radio group. A guy from the Sac Sheriff's Department that was just a ham. And yeah, pretty much Sacramento City Communication Center. So that was most of the guys, and some of them were officers from those departments that stepped in with their ham radio equipment and the most simplest of radio direction finding equipment to go try to track this down. So we held our first meeting immediately at the Sacramento City Police Department's 911 Center. We kind of decided on what we would do and how we would do it. And in the middle of that night, there was no traffic, nothing. We came back the second night and had a meeting. We were in the middle of the meeting when at 4 o'clock the transmission started, and it appeared to be coming from North Sacramento. Why? Because of that voted receiver system on that channel was lighting up on a receiver in North Sacramento. And the text said that was not unusual. It seemed to start in North Sacramento, but then it would show up on receivers in East, Central, and South. So we all headed out. Some people had fixed locations. One of our people, Rick Miscuscum, he had really fancy stuff from OES as a spectrum analyzer with a really nice Yagi on UHF, and he went up to the Executive Sacramento Airport Control Tower. And he sat up there with all those glass windows around. He could walk around and watch. And then we had another one on a water tower down by South Sacramento. I think the tower's gone now, but we had another one on that one. But then a couple of them were in state buildings up high, and then the rest of them were in mobiles, as I was. And they were just driving around hoping to see that signal. Now, we knew their system had apparently been infiltrated, so I had a large cache of UHF radios on the state police radio system. And so we dispersed those radios to everybody with chargers so that we could all communicate with the guys who are in the back of the telecom shack in Sacramento PD. So that he could call out, and he had a ham with him. They could call out which receiver on which frequency in which area was lighting up, which was really valuable to this whole thing. So that was my van. I finagled that within a couple of years of being there as telecom sergeant. I said, I need something to haul equipment to natural disasters, because I had a couple hundred radios, repeaters. In fact, you can see some of that stuff on the table. Well, that got cut off. But I had portable repeaters on all 3 of our frequencies, Motorola briefcase repeaters with the mag mount antennas, and a big fancy programmable repeater that could be programmed on the fly. And we could set those up for national governors events down in LA. We could take a hotel and make it a good radio deal clear into the basement. In fact, we had a Republican governor's thing that ended up out on the Queen Mary. And we moved our dispatchers to the cabin of the Queen Mary, except that thing is all steel. So I had to take an antenna and coax, and I dragged it outside, climbed up this little ladder, and stuck it on the side of the smokestack for the Queen Mary. Worked like a champ. That would allow them to communicate into the ballroom in the hull of the ship. So that was cool. Anyway, that little van, all those are magnetic stripes on there. So I could go undercover with that thing, pull all those magnet strips off, and I could just drive around without anybody seeing, and I did not have the stripes on that day. On top of the roof, to the right of that green sign, is a box about this big. about yay like that. It's got 4 antennas sticking out of it. So there's lots of different ways of doing RDF, and most of you are familiar with the, just kind of get it across polarization to the signal and follow that route. Well, what I had, and I didn't order it. The guy before me who didn't know anything about radio, he ordered it. I don't know why he did, but it was there in a box when I took over the shop. And I said, what is this? I said, this is like $20,000 piece of equipment. And I don't know how to use it. I'm going to have to figure it out real fast. And what it was an ICOM R9000 or R7000 receiver, which is a really expensive state-of-the-art receiver from, I don't know, way down here, DC to light, let's put it that way, clear up into the microwave receive capability. And it has a little IF output on the back of it. And so when the antenna comes in, when the signal comes into the antenna, which is this plate, and it's got these 4 antennas. They're on 4 corners of this square plate. And in the cab of the vehicle is the R7000 receiver, which you merely tune to the frequency you want to monitor. And what did we say about repeaters? We have to be listening to the 465 input to the repeater. Otherwise, all we're going to do is hear the repeater output. We're going to go chase the repeater. So the receiver, we turned the receiver to whatever the frequency was for Sac PD. They were in the UHF T-band. If you don't know, there was VHF, VHF high, VHF low. Then there was UHF, but there were not enough frequencies at one point. With the advent of cable television, they realized they didn't need all these frequencies for television band. So they started confiscating some of that and moving it to public safety, and then it's called, and when you look at a scanner, it says UHF T-band. The oldest scanners didn't have T-band. All modern scanners have T-band. Sac PD was up in the T-band, but this radio would hear it just fine. Then on top of the radio was a little radar screen, little box with a round radar screen. Just basically looked like radar. It had a green dot in the middle. Let's make this a little bit bigger so those on home can see it. So it had this big, beautiful green screen and about a dozen buttons on it. Half of them I didn't know what they did, but it didn't matter. We got a green dot in the middle, and that's you. That's where you are, the green dot. When this antenna plate detected a signal across these 2 antennas and across these 2 antennas, it could actually look at the difference in the phase angle of the signal as it's coming in and measure that difference and assign 1 an X and 1 a Y. It's just a plotting map, X, Y. So on here, it would give you another green dot where the X and Y lined up. So it's triangulation, but on top of a moving vehicle, which was great. We could move while we're watching the dot move around like this. Like that. I could actually watch it as it rolled around. It also had some sense of range, depending on where you put those buttons on there, and if you anticipated you were dealing with a 50-watt mobile radio, you could get some idea that if it was that far out, then it was, it was quite a few miles out. If it was a little closer to you, but then you expanded it to, or lowered it to a 5-watt, it pushes it back out again, but tells you that there is a range. He's only half a mile or a mile away from you and coming at you. And there was a nice green line, that green line that went up to that dot. So you could just kind of follow that dot around until you found this radio. So that's what I was using. Nobody else had one of those. And that was kind of the big key to the whole success of this thing. We would have probably found it eventually just using triangulation, but we did it in 2 nights using that thing. And here's what we did. So the radio almost always started out in North Sacramento, and it would cause havoc up there on the North Sac frequency. But every once in a while, it would start to wreak havoc out here in East Sacramento. And then once in a while, it would go down here into downtown, and sometimes just south of town, but it didn't ever seem to go to South Sacramento. Usually stopped just below the freeway there, around where DMV is. Yes? That was interesting. It would go on for a half an hour at a time, and then it would just suddenly quit. It was, you know, when you start doing these kind of things, you're doing a log. And the tech at Sacramento had done a log, and it was just all over. It was schizophrenic. There was no rhyme or reason. It was mostly at night. It would go on for minutes. It'd go on for hours, or a half an hour or more. We were really surprised that the radio, or that any radio would handle that long. But he did have a charger, supposedly under the scenario they had suggested. So that first night we didn't have anything, so we went home. The second night, we were in the meeting. At about 4 o'clock, all of a sudden the thing started lighting up. Radio was on, and it was pegging the voting receiver system somewhere in North Sacramento, and they were calling off where that receiver was, and we started all heading in that direction. So it started in North Sacramento, and it went around causing havoc in North Sac. And then about 9 o'clock, all of a sudden, it started heading south on 80 towards where it met with 99. Of course, now 80 is a whole different animal going out towards I-5. But at the time, 80 met at 99 here in Sacramento. It started coming this way. We had a gentleman up in the towers, executive tower, and he could see it on his equipment. And he could see it in North Sacramento, but he could see the range changing towards him. So it was heading south towards him. And I'm seeing it at the same time, and I'm heading towards the north to go to North Sacramento to track this thing down. So as I'm heading up Interstate 80 back towards North Sacramento off-ramps, the voting receiver system says, oh, it's kicking on a receiver up here towards Sacramento, because they had voting receivers in the other areas around North Sac. In case they got into a pursuit, the receivers would pick up those signals going clear into the other districts. All of a sudden, they said it was coming to the south because it picked up a receiver there. And on my little screen, on Interstate 80, in my little van, chugging north, all of a sudden, there's that blip, 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 blip. And it's like, I should have been able to look right across the freeway divider and see it, but I couldn't. I didn't see it, but it went past me. And I reported that to everybody. And Sac City techs confirmed that it was hitting on a receiver down in downtown Sacramento. And the guys up in the towers said, yeah, it's coming our way. And what it did was, by the time I got off the freeway, got back on the freeway, I was following it, and it went off down Diesel Way, and got off on one of those freeway off-ramps there and headed down towards Broadway. And I sort of almost lost a little because I'm up here on the high-rise freeway. And as I got off the freeway, I picked it up again, and it was heading south into that housing area. Okay, it headed down into this housing area here. The call went out immediately. They had a captain and some lieutenants and sergeants. They had all sorts of people available, and they called all units to surround this area. They were going to put up a roadblock, no man's going past this, all around that area, because then it started to stop. And then I lost the signal for a minute or two. I mean, it was probably about 4 or 5 minutes. I thought, oh, this is crap, we're so close. But then all of a sudden it came back up, and I was able to drive right to it. And the problem was, it was a modest little house in a nice neighborhood with a Sacramento City police car sitting in front of it. Okay, so now the commanders are coming in, the lieutenants, we're all parked about a half a block away. They're talking to me, how sure are you? How sure? I said, come look. It's pointing right there. And they said, because this could turn really bad for this officer and this department if it's a problem child. And I said, I don't know. I'm just telling you, it's in that house right there, dude. It's there. So they went over, a team of them went over, knocked on the door, including a tech from the Sacramento City Police Department. They knocked on the door, and they said, hello, Officer so-and-so. Could we talk to you? And he said, yeah. And he said, where's your handy-talkie? Don't touch it. Because it was going. He went into the kitchen, and there it was sitting on the counter, and it was transmitting. They picked it up. Again, no noise, no audio, nothing, just transmission, just a dead carrier. They picked it up, and it went away. And I had a couple of the law enforcement guys just standing there watching it say, it went away. Whatever they did in there, it went away. The sergeant came rolling in, and he said, oh, that's Officer so-and-so. Yeah, I gave him permission he always takes his break at home, so it was his lunch hour, and I gave him permission to leave the north area and go home right here in Sacramento to eat his lunch. So now we're saying, okay, this has got to be a radio problem. The next morning, the radio was delivered to their telecom people it was a private company out here, I think on Auburn Boulevard, that did their repairs. And a forensic study of the radio was done. Next photo, if you can do that. Yeah. This is probably not the exact model of radio, but from the 1990s, this is about what they looked like. They had a metal case and a kind of a semi-metal front face with the microphone and the speaker on it. Somewhere in a repair process, a week or two before this incident happened, when this radio was put back together, a tech failed to carefully move wires out from along the edge where the rubber water seal is, squished that thing down, tightened the screws, cranked on them because it didn't seem to want to fit right, and he cut through that plastic coating on one wire that didn't activate the voice, the microphone, but it did activate transmit, the push to talk. And if you touched that radio and squished it just a little, or put it in your holster and bumped it up against the door, you could activate it. So now why was it bopping around? It was from North Sac, which made sense because most of it started in North Sac. So the question was, why did this radio automatically go to these other frequencies? Because the guy's sitting in his patrol in a very boring areas of town at one time. He's cruising around, all of a sudden he's got his mobile radio on his frequency, and then he hears about this cool pursuit over in East Sacramento. So he'd reach down and instinctively count 1, 2, 3, East Sacramento. Must be over. Nothing going on. Nothing. It's over. And of course he'd leave the radio there for a while, and eventually he'd turn it back to the main channel, his main channel. But whoever had that radio that night was turning that button to different channels to listen to the activity and never kind of got it because it was different guys on different nights, on different shifts. Nobody was comparing notes because they didn't think a radio would be the problem. So that's why it was popping around. That's why it was hitting on different channels. It was one little wire encased in the case that was shorting out, sending the push-to-talk to ground, activating the radio, causing total chaos in Sacramento for some time. These were all hams, a few of them with some good technical skills, one guy worked for a company, OES guys, but they were all hams, did this, ham radio operators. So we go back to the first question on my novice test, what's the purpose of amateur radio? The purpose of amateur radio, as I told you in my last presentation, to build a technical pool of civilians who can step in when government can't or won't to fix things and make things happen. And we did that. These guys did that. And we're going to give them a hand.